I'll be highlighting three main topic areas in today's presentation. The first topic is the literature review, discussing the history of instructional technology and its impact on today's teaching and learning environment. I'll spend time on how learning methods have become consolidated and how blended learning theories and acceptance factors impact the proposed study. The second topic is a brief background on the findings for the pilot study, the perceptions of online strategies and digital readiness in the COVID-19 environment, which was used to develop the comprehensive institutional model, or the SIM, to assist higher educational institutions with dealing with the COVID-induced challenges. And the third topic is my proposed dissertation study, to explore the efficacy of the comprehensive institutional model using design-based research in a real-world environment. Slide 3 highlights the key milestones in the timeline for instructional technology and education. The origin of instructional technology is attributed to Sir Isaac Pitman in 1840 of Great Britain. He pioneered a mail correspondence course using a shorthand technique to transcribe Bible passages. In the United States, Anna Elliott Tucker founded the first correspondence model for in-home learning in 1873, quickly followed by Illinois Wesleyan College in 1874, who offered the first in absentia program for distance learners. Over the next 20 years, there were some major breakthroughs in technology, and one of those was in 1894 with the radio, which opened new doors for educators to explore reaching adult learners. Also in 1922, TV broadcasting opened new venues to education as well. In 1933, the University of Iowa began experimenting with TV broadcasting, and by 1952, the Federal Communication Commission allowed educators to reserve exclusive channels locally with their TV stations. And by 1966, 2/3 of the TV stations in the US had license agreements with educational institutions. And so in the 1960s, we then have the introduction of timeshare computing. Again, this was the first time adult learners were able to have online forums, join with message boards, and even start building communication. And then a key milestone in the world of technology, and especially in higher education, was in 1980, and that's the introduction of the personal computer by Apple. It caused revolutionary changes in many industries, including higher education. It was the first time a technology platform enabled learning with humans and technology together interacting. Also during this period, computer-based training emerged, driving the practice of CD-based training. It literally exploded. The rapid growth of multimedia technologies allowed instructors to develop course content using text, video, and graphics. And then in 1999, with the public introduction of the World Wide Web, the world, and certainly higher education, was changed forever. Higher educational traditional teaching and learning processes, as well as its existing socioeconomic and sustainability models, were terribly impacted. Everything was going to change with the internet. And then in 2002, we had expansion in this area. The internet fueled online learning, especially through the development of learning management systems, which enabled the hosting and delivering of various course content, and of course, setting the stage for today's digital learning and teaching environment. And as we move forward, by 2011, According to the literature, online learning, or what was now being called e-learning, was part of most higher educational institutions' long-term strategy, driving investments in technology and looking for sustainability. So in 2018, the impact of technology had spurred many and various different delivery models, modes, paradigms in higher education. The terms describing the modern educational environment were being used interchangeably, and there was no agreement among educators and course designers on concise definitions or pedagogical goals. Some people used e-learning, some used distance learning, some used blended learning. According to the literature, blended learning has gained popularity as the catch-all term, centering around common themes of using technology to integrate face-to-face and online paradigms to attain pedagogical goals to enhance teaching and student outcomes. So then, in 2019, again, we had certainly another watershed or epic event, sometimes called a black swan event in the literature, and that was the COVID pandemic, which certainly had a significant impact on higher education, with technology being a critical factor for higher educational institutions to simply remain operational during the time. So now that we find ourselves in 2024, the impact of COVID-19 induced challenges and the external socio-economic factors that hit very hard in the higher educational realm in 2023, such as reduced enrollment, higher interest rates, changing policy, they impact the sustainability for higher educational institutions today. And so we'll have more details on that later in the presentation. Therefore, the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated the consolidation of learning methods in higher education, requiring more virtual options for course attendance based on social distancing requirements. As the various implementations of blended learning emerged, the challenges of digital readiness and adoption factors for students, faculty, and administrators became readily apparent and a reality that most higher educational institutions needed to address. Many scholars and educators realized blended learning was a complex phenomenon in itself, and more research was needed on how the theoretical foundations for blended learning impacted the adoption factors for various modalities, especially for those modalities requiring more technical and digital skills, such as HyFlex. According to Wong et al. In 2023, who completed a systematic review of HyFlex articles that had been published over the last 10 years, although the number of HyFlex models have more than doubled since 2020, most of the articles examine the features or design of HyFlex learning instead of the adoption factors or the constructs leading to HyFlex adoption. Thus, the need for the proposed study exploring the impact of the comprehensive institutional model, which is built on recommendations for blended learning, specifically adoption of HyFlex, is needed to address higher educational institutional challenges for administrators, faculty, and students. I'll now discuss the second presentation topic, which is the background for the proposed study based on the pilot study findings by McCray et al. In 2023. The pilot study, Perceptions of Online Strategies and Digital Readiness in the COVID-19 Environment, was a qualitative instrumental case study conducted to explore the experiences and insights of key stakeholders about integrating and relying on a combination of online and blended learning strategies for teaching and learning during the COVID-19 emergency remote training and the months following. The study participants included administrators, faculty, and graduate students in the School of Education at one private university located in South Central Texas. And the pilot study's key findings really were the factors impacted blended learning for HyFlex adoption include lack of faculty readiness, which included skills, attitude, and certainly mindset, technology investments, which was infrastructure and classroom technology, graduate student support needs, which included access to technical and support resources and flexibility, and graduate student expectations, which was that faculty readiness should be a given. Faculty presence was so important and they needed that support. They needed engagement, and also they were concerned about the long-term plans and sustainability of the educational institution. The study results, grounded in the data, enabled the research team to build the comprehensive institutional model for universities to support blended and HyFlex learning based on blended learning and HyFlex adoption factors and recommendations to help ensure readiness in the new normal. The model organizes how aligning administrators, faculty, and graduate students through best practice recommendations and the use of cyclical feedback loops can effectively impact blended and HyFlex environments and the outcomes they achieve. Although the challenges that were discovered in the study are still with us today, and they're exacerbated by the current socioeconomic factors of reduced enrollment, higher operating costs, some up to 18 to 20% for higher educational institutions, political policies, and higher interest rates that impact borrowing for technology upgrades. We still need a way to address these. Therefore, the need for the SIM, an integrated model to help higher educational institutions address these challenges, is critical. And the challenges that I just discussed, therefore, lead to the three key needs for the proposed study. The first key need that the proposed study will address is institutional priorities and sustainability. In the post-COVID world, institutions need to understand what's important and necessary to remain viable in both the short term and the long term. Institutional transformation is not about installing a few cameras in a classroom for virtual access. It requires a top-down plan to coordinate resources, to mitigate the current challenges that I've just covered, and to plan for the future. And this leads me to the second need that will be addressed by the proposed study. And that's higher educational institutions need an integrated model that incorporates the voices and priorities of their relevant stakeholders, from policymakers to faculty to graduate students, for engaging in emerging blended and HyFlex environments. And the model needs to enable ongoing communication and feedback loops amongst the stakeholders to support iterative changes and continual improvements to generate successful learning and teaching outcomes. And lastly, the model needs to be real-world tested. Many researchers provide strategies and guidance to help address the post-COVID challenges, but few models have been tested in the real-world institutional HyFlex environment. The proposed study findings will be used to validate the efficacy of the SIM and provide additional enhancements and refinement to the model. So moving forward to the context of the context of the proposed study is shown below. The research will be conducted at a private university in South Central Texas. The targeted population is administrators, faculty, and graduate students in the School of Graduate Education. Also, the pilot study data was collected from 2021 through 2022. And another key contextual factor is that the COVID-induced pathway shift in institutional resources is still very real, and those factors really need to be looked at on how higher educational institutions can help deal with many challenges, especially those that were from COVID and now also exacerbated in the current environment. The SIM produces a model that will help assist the higher educational institution in meeting the challenges. However, the model must be tested in a real-world environment, and that is really the purpose of our study. Moving from the contextual discussion to the real problems or gaps that the study addresses I would like to share a couple quotes. According to Guppy et al. In 2022, reverting to prior conventional methods would be untenable. Institutions must find a new normal, offering flexibility in ways to address the COVID-induced challenges. Additionally, Howell et al. 2023 contend HyFlex is one of these institutional reinventions currently underway to make higher education more accessible to all. Again, referring back to those pathway shifts. So there's 4 problems or gaps that the proposed study will address. And they fall into 2 categories, real world and scholarly. And the first problem or real world gap is the one that we've been briefly talking about, these post-COVID challenges and how the STEM was designed to help higher educational universities address these issues. However, it's also important to think about the model. It provides a way to align and synergize decision-making and execution with the key stakeholders. And this is necessary to embrace actions to move toward a new normal, such as a high-flex environment. Unfortunately, change is hard, time-consuming, and expensive. So many institutions remain stuck in their past policies and practices, and they keep their fingers crossed that they will be able to go back to the old way of doing business. So this leads me to the next set of problems, which I call the scholarly gaps, and that there are few models to address the post-COVID challenges that have actually been tested in a high-flex environment. The third problem related to the scholarly gap is there are limited models that addressed higher educational groups through an integrated model, such as getting information from administrators, students, and faculty. Additionally, the fourth problem is also related to the scholarly gap in that the models for HyFlex are lacking, and I could not find any that were actually using design-based research to iteratively assess HyFlex design and delivery interventions in a higher educational environment. Therefore, using the CARS model to discuss the associated literature with the problems, there's certainly a wealth of supporting literature on the first problem, which is the persisting challenges from COVID and now the aftermath impacting higher educational institutions, operations, and sustainability. To identify related literature for the scholarly gaps, a bibliometric search using the Web of Science database was performed to identify comparable HyFlex models to the SIM. 3 lenses were used in the searches. HyFlex models in teaching and learning, HyFlex models that used an integrated stakeholder approach, and lastly, any HyFlex models that use design-based research to test their results. Based on the Web of Science database, I originally came up with 113 documents that were identified, very quickly distilled down to 34, and then down to 6 articles that I could see some related elements with the SIM. I also did the same search over on Google Scholar, which returned more articles with the HyFlex components. But these also very quickly came down to the same 6 articles that you see included here. And the articles, many articles were excluded because they only focused on one topic, especially with HyFlex infrastructure. Based on the bibliometric search and actually the Google Scholar search, one thing the 6 models had in common is that none of them had been tested in a real-world HyFlex environment, and they had no evidence-based results that could substantiate any of their recommendations. And you can see from the slide, the 6 really fell into talking about HyFlex adoption. Then one article did actually talk about using DBR, but it's really to test a pedagogical course design in one semester. And then 3 of the other HyFlex models did give recommendations for getting stakeholder lens, had a stakeholder approach. But again, none of them had any type of tested recommendations or evidence-based results that would actually confirm the efficacy of their models. So this moves us to the purpose of the proposed study. And the purpose of this qualitative instrumental case study is to explore the efficacy of a pre-existing model, the SIM, to improve and prepare how higher educational institutions adopt blended learning technologies, foster faculty readiness, promote investment in technology and training, and support graduate students' learning needs and expectations in the COVID-19 post-pandemic era. Specifically, this study will explore how the SIMS framework impacts the HyFlex learning and teaching environment at a private university in South Texas, which includes administration, School of Education faculty, and graduate students using the design-based research methodology. Also, the scope of this research aims to generate rich empirical evidence from testing the interventions generated through the SIMS integrated communication and feedback loops using design-based research. The findings will inform and enhance strategies other higher educational institutions may consider for effectively navigating in the blended lending landscape using an integrated stakeholder approach with a cyclical feedback loop to support and enhance HyFlex learning and teaching environments. The study's primary research questions are shown on the slide, and these questions primarily tie to issue or problem 1, and that is, does the SIM help mitigate the challenges, the post-COVID challenges that higher educational institutions are facing? And the research sub-questions shown on the next slide. And the sub-research questions really tie to the scholarly gaps in the study, tied to the testing of the HyFlex model in a real environment. Also, do the models include an integrated stakeholder view, and also the use of design-based research to test the iterative updates, refinement, and communication flows. The study's conceptual model provides a good summary of the key areas that we've just discussed. So starting at the left, the key findings from the previous study grounded in the data were used to develop the SIM, which is shown on the right. And the SIM was developed to address and help mitigate the COVID-induced and even today the post-COVID challenges that the higher educational institutions are facing. And the SIM embodies the blended learning foundational theories, especially those around adult learning and communication. Also, Beatty's HyFlex guidelines, technology acceptance model by Davies. Also, the cyclical communication and feedback loops embrace experiential learning cycles. The proposed study is going to explore and validate the efficacy of the SIM using a systematic iterative testing approach, which is Reeves' design-based research, and you can see that on the far right side, with key stakeholders of graduate students, faculty, and administrators. And then the evidence-based testing results will help close the real-world and scholarly gaps. The evidence-based results will then feed back into the needs, and the SIM will be refined to address these merging and changing needs, which is shown here on the left. And so the SIM will continue to refine and become better as the more information it is being fed into and being used. So I also feel that I also contend that there will be additional theories that come out of the study. As you can see, self-determination and attachment theories, more HyFlex principles, and technology acceptance models such as user perception, ease of use, effectiveness of the technology, and the impact of stakeholder theory. The researcher's positionality also impacts the proposal study's design and the interpretation. My positionality in regard to the project follows my ontology of constructivist. I believe knowledge is created also based on social interactions and our experiences. I've chosen a qualitative research approach because it allows an in-depth examination of insights based on perceptions and experiences of the central phenomena, which is really testing the effectiveness of the SIM. My epistemology is pragmatic. I diligently explore the best research options and approaches that are going to best address the research questions and fit the context and the audience. And my axiology is very much value-based on honesty, integrity, and rigor. I am a member of the graduate student population. Therefore, it will be very important for me to disclose my biases and any possible conflicts, and I will certainly do this through bracketing, continuous reflexivity, also adherence to design tools by Yin, Stake, and Miriam, which really makes sure the data is coming back, answering the research questions, also through triangulation and peer review to make sure that everything is being correctly coded. Moving on to the research design, I'm using a qualitative instrumental case study. I chose this design because my study is focused on gaining insights into a specific phenomena, and that is exploring the efficacy and testing that with the SIM. I'm working to gain a broader knowledge around this specific issue. The study is based on one phenomena at one university and one location at a designated period. And my aim is to generate a holistic perspective, which will add to the general transferability of the evidence, and the model can be documented, which may be important to help other higher educational institutions in their challenges. The methodology I'm using is design-based research, and this model is attributed to Reeves back in 2006. And it was chosen because it systematically collects data through an iterative design and intervention approach, and this supports the cyclical nature of the SIM, the feedback, and the communication loops. Reeves' DBR approach, also his particular model, was chosen based on his work in educational interventions and the citations he's received in this area over the last 15 years. And DBR supports the study objectives for the following reasons. It's a multi-user approach, and also the SIM, any interventions are based on the multiple stakeholders, administrators, faculty, and students. Also, it is iterative, which aligns with the SIM's communication and feedback loops. Also, data is systematically re-examined upon and reflected upon within and between cycles. Again, ties back to systematically analyzing the data and looking back to code to theory, and also theoretical sampling that I'll be talking about here shortly. Supports the code to theory, and also it looks at the intervention outcomes that are then used to go and update and refine the SIM. What I'd like to do is just give a brief example of how I'm going to apply design-based research methodology in my study. You'll see at the top of the slide are the steps outlined by Reeves. So applying those steps is that I would start with a practical problem, which is my real world problem, which is the challenges, the post-COVID challenges, and the COVID-induced challenges for which the SIM was created. And then I would take the SIM stakeholder recommendations, which are the solutions that were proposed to help mitigate the challenges for administrators, faculty, and graduate students. And I would actually build an interview guide based on those recommendations. And then I would go do my data collection through interviews and focus groups to see if the recommendations had been adopted, were they realistic, or have things changed? Are there new trends? And then that data would be, the evidence-based data would then be analyzed, and then it would be fed back into the SIM to refine and certainly look at theory application and other upcoming recommendations or any new emerging design principles that may result from the data collection and the analysis. Purposeful sampling will primarily be used for participant selection, and it will be focused for 3 areas, which is administrators, faculty, and graduate students. And the key inclusion factor will be administrators must have been involved supporting, and faculty must have been involved teaching, and students must have been enrolled in at least one HighFlex graduate course from 2021 to the current academic year. Also, recruiting strategies will include very targeted strategies where direct email, personal phone calls, asking to be a class guest speaker to talk about the study, as well as talk about the study during the upcoming research symposium, and also be able to advertise or to gain recognition for the study using any type of graduate study, social media, or announcements. A variety of data collection methods and sources will be used, such as interviews, focus groups, course data and artifacts, also such as discussion forums, classroom observations, observing both on-site and even how students are attending via virtual options, institutional archival data, and then researcher memos and journaling and bracketing. The sample size will be emerging, driven by the saturation of data. However, I do have some preliminary participation goals that I would like to get administrators 3 to 6, faculty 3 to 6, and graduate students 15 to 21 with 3 focus groups of 5 to 7 participants each. And as I mentioned previously, an interview guide will be built on the SIM stakeholder recommendations that can be used to collect the data. Analysis that I'll be using are shown below. I will use in vivo coding to identify language patterns, also identify emerging insights, build conceptual patterns, and also to analyze and compare those findings. Next, I'll do category coding to organize my findings into categories, and then also selective coding to organize the categories into themes. I will also use theoretical sampling to consistently compare old and new data. This will also help in the data validation, supporting saturation and quality assurance. Also, I will link in Yen's evidence model that links data continually back to the research question, as well as other suggestions from Miriam and Stake, such as member checking, triangulation, and peer review. The estimated study timeline is very fluid, but I would like to start beginning my data collection right after I get my IRB approval. And these are just some estimates. And a key consideration here is using design-based research is that you are constantly analyzing the data and comparing it as you're collecting data. So those, therefore, both data collection and analysis will be happening simultaneously throughout the project. The ethical considerations and risk mitigation strategies are shown below. The greatest risk that I see is the loss of personal confidentiality. Again, steps that will be taken to mitigate that will be pseudonym names. Also, the source documents will be securely stored, encrypted, password protected. Also, all participants must provide and read a very detailed signed confidentiality agreement and an approved consent form. And me as a researcher, I must have back a electronic, either a PDF or a signed written document 48 hours before I actually do the data collection. And before I begin each of the sessions, I will also go back over the confidentiality and also the consent form to ensure everyone is in agreement. Also, for any type of remote interviews, cameras can remain off. There can be personal synonyms, avatars used, and the key to those participants will also be securely stored in a file, off-site, encrypted, and password protected. The potential study challenges and the mitigation steps is participant access. I do have targeted recruit strategies, email calls, class presentations, social media, also speaking to different classes. I also want to encourage students that participating in research is another great way for them to learn. Also, a secure venue for interviews. I'm willing to schedule on, off campus, different options. We can meet outside, even remotely, as long as the participant feels comfortable. Also, remote participants access. I will connect with each of the participants if they have a problem or a question on any of the tools, such as Zoom or Teams being used. I can do some tutoring on the tool and also talk with them again in a pre-interview. Researcher bias, I've mentioned this before. I will certainly disclose any of my personal bias that I recognize. I will use bracketing on a regular basis, reflexivity, and also take copious research notes that will be included as part of the data. And last but not least, especially data validation would be triangulation of the different methods and using multiple methods and sources. Member checking to go back and make sure that I do clearly understand the concept that was being communicated. Theoretical sampling, also the use of theory and literature to confirm the findings or to maybe look for additional insights. And also be very much aware of when I start getting repeating comments or constructs as data saturation. And we'll use my committee members, you, which I hope for peer reviews and to address any questions or concerns. The significance of the study will be in addressing the real world problems as well as helping close the scholarly gaps that you see here on the chart. The real world problems are those COVID-induced and the post-COVID challenges that currently persist. Higher educational institutions need a way to address and help mitigate these challenges through an integrated model that allows the stakeholders to communicate and also have communication flows and feedback that allow them to test interventions, get the feedback, and then be able to improve their model. Also, the scholarly gaps that there are few tested models in the literature for HyFlex and even more limited models that are using integrated stakeholder approaches and even less models that are using design-based research to iteratively test HyFlex design components. So I trust the results of the evidence-based data from the study will actually be able to provide some insight on sustainability. It will be a contribution of knowledge as far as the scholarly gaps and the general transferability that the evidence-based results, the rich text, and documentation can be used by other higher educational institutions. And personal significance, it's very gratifying and humbling to be able to continue my scholarly work and to be able to test the model that was built on previous work and scholarship. Also, I am a first-generation scholar, so I will be the first person who graduated, even with a bachelor's degree, a master's, and certainly a doctor's on my mother's side. So this is also very important to me and the importance of education. So as I started with Nelson Mandela, a quote from Nelson Mandela, who is one of my most respected personalities or people, is that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Thank you for allowing me to present, and I look forward to your comments and your support. Study.